appearances. I also agree, obviously, that there were appearances, but I argue that the appearances were hallucinations. There isn't really any evidence to discount that. And I'll end with that, and we'll continue more later on.
Shortly after my father-in-law died, a friend of the family, who had been very close to that bit of the family, experienced my father-in-law in the room with him, looking very well, smiling, greeting him, and then disappearing again. And I've heard other similar stories like this from people that I've known. A friend whose daughter was tragically murdered in a random shooting in America. Her boyfriend, who was hundreds of miles away, suddenly experienced her as though physical, but certainly visible, in the room with him. And this is actually a common phenomenon which has been written up. People have done scientific studies of it. And the thing is this, that was well known in the ancient world as well. People knew that that sort of thing happened. So the idea, which some have suggested, that actually that's what went on 3 days after Jesus' death, that his followers found that he mysteriously appeared and then disappeared again, well, there it is. That's one of those death-induced hallucinations, or whatever you call it. Odd spiritual phenomena, but I don't think even those are pure hallucinations, because they can happen to people when they don't know that the person concerned has been killed or has died. So there's all sorts of mysterious things going on there. However, the point is this: those phenomena, when they occur and when people realize that they've occurred, are taken as a sure sign that the person is dead, not that the person is now alive again. In other words, if you have one of those experiences of somebody that you knew, whether or not you knew that they just died, the thing that it means pretty certainly is that they have died and that they are dead. Whereas the seeings of Jesus, which the early disciples had, were taken as clear signs that he wasn't dead, that he was alive again.
I think the fact that 500 people at the same time claim to have seen the same thing goes against the idea of a hallucination. We don't have psychological data for mass hallucination of the same thing. People hallucinate as individuals. And so this again goes against the evidence. You also need to be predisposed to believe in the hallucination, to have some kind of seed of a thought of why this might happen. And again, that goes against the scholarly consensus that there wasn't this idea of an individual resurrection, an individual Jesus.
Well, it's interesting that the hallucination hypothesis has had a sort of resurrection over the last 20 years, you could say. But it suffers from the same problems that it did 100 years ago, and it was largely rejected. It's what we do know about hallucinations that makes the resurrection appearances of Jesus extremely unlikely. For example, in multiple studies, we find that about 50% of bereaving senior adults grieving over the loss of the loved one, about 50% of them experience some sort of a hallucination of their deceased loved one. And these are the group of people most likely to experience a hallucination. But of those sorts of hallucinations, only 7% experience a visual hallucination. So that's what I mean is 7% of all senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one experience a visual hallucination of their loved one. Now think about this. When it comes to the disciples, it says that Jesus appeared to them. All these things about appearing, these are visual. He appeared to all of them, all of the 12, and then to more than 500 at one time. So you've got not just 7%, but an unthinkable 100% who would have seen Jesus, visually hallucinated Jesus, simultaneously, and the content would have been the same. For example, they hallucinated Jesus rather than the Jewish or Roman guards coming through the door. So these things make it extremely unlikely that what the disciples experienced with these appearances were hallucinations.
But I think that when you weigh this counter-explanation by the standard criteria that are used for assessing historical hypotheses, like explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, and so forth, this isn't a credible explanation. Take, for example, the empty tomb. The empty tomb obviously cannot be explained as a result of psychological or hallucinatory factors, because it's an objective historical fact that would be available for anybody living in Jerusalem to go and investigate. The fact that The belief in Jesus' resurrection originated in Jerusalem under the eyes of its enemies who had publicly crucified Jesus is an astonishing fact. It could never have happened in the face of a tomb containing his corpse. So the empty tomb of Jesus is an objective fact that cannot be explained away psychologically.
Again, you have the question of the empty tomb, if it was a hallucination. What did actually happen to Jesus' body? Something must have happened to that body. Scholars are united on the fact of the empty tomb. Even those who don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus don't question whether Jesus' tomb was empty. The evidence points to this. Other explanations might be offered, but where did Jesus' body go?
Had they had experiences like those post-death bereavement experiences, whatever, then it would have been perfectly compatible with going to the tomb and saying, but he's still in there. And so basically he is not only dead, but he's very dead, because we've had those experiences which mean that someone's dead. So the appearances plus the empty tomb together mean something radically new has happened.
Secondly, as for the post-mortem appearances, these outstrip anything in the case books of hallucinatory experiences studied by psychologists. They didn't just appear to one person, but to many persons, not just to individuals, but to groups of people, not just on one occasion or at one locale, but many different occasions at different locales, not just under one set of circumstances, but under a variety of circumstances, not just to believers, but to unbelievers as well. And so in order to try to explain these psychologically, you've got to cobble together all sorts of different hallucinatory experiences to try to make a parallel to the resurrection apparitions. And there really just isn't anything in psychology that parallels it.
In the book of Acts, chapter 12, Peter is expecting to be executed. The early church is expecting that he's going to be executed. He's in prison. They want to kill him the next day. The church is praying. They're in a secret room somewhere, and they're praying their socks off that Peter will be released. Then an extraordinary thing happens. Peter gets out of prison with an angel opening the doors for him. A very weird story. And Peter comes and knocks at the door. And a little maid called Rhoda runs to the door and hears Peter's voice and is so excited she doesn't open the door. She runs back and says, it's Peter, it's Peter. And they say, you're mad. And then she says, no, it is him. And then they say, it must be his angel. Now that's a very significant thing. What do they mean? They think that Peter has in fact been killed in the prison, and that this is one of those post-mortem hallucinations that we've all heard of, and that this means that Peter is, as it were, coming spiritually to say goodbye before then he remains dead. And that would be perfectly compatible with them going to the prison the next day, getting his body, burying it, and grieving. So that's precisely what they didn't do with Jesus, because this wasn't a hallucination. This was something radically, thoroughly different.
The idea that the appearances of Jesus were mass hallucinations doesn't work, and the hallucination theory can't explain the fact that his tomb was empty. His body really had gone. So if someone wants to believe the hallucination theory, they have to bring in two separate explanations that are both unlikely. One for the mass hallucinations and another for the empty tomb.